Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malfers Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is AJ and there's Scott as always. And today we're talking about 5 myths about leadership accountability. And so this is a great topic, Scott. And I'm glad that you had this article for us this week. So kick us off on, so now you have it framed up as myths. So keep in mind as we go through this, we're going to be doing some myth busting. But you've also got a rather provocative first title here, Scott, that churches without leadership accountability have a one-way ticket to organizational implosion. Are you overstating it?
No, not at all. I mean, have you ever seen this happen in a church that you've attended or that you have worked on staff at? It happens all the time. The question is, how big is the dysfunction and how long is that fuse? You can go years and years and years and years and years with a low accountability culture and it not be a problem. But when it finally catches up to you, and it always does, it causes problems. Church splits, fired pastors, people leaving the church in disgust and anger, high turnover rates among staff. There's all kinds of things. The implosion looks different, but it always happens.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm sure most of our audience listening is, as we go through the myths and kind of think about some of these symptoms that they're going to recognize them probably in their own ministries where either maybe they've been the leader or they've worked underneath a leader or leadership team in which they probably will recognize these things. And, there's some high profile implosions that happen and everybody is like, oh, wonder what was behind that.
What happened then?
Some of the myths today might maybe shed some light on what could have been. But for everyone, that makes Christianity Today or CNN, there are countless others that you'll just never know about, and maybe that you've heard about or been involved with. That I think these 5 things will give you some thought on how things are going in your own church. And some easy course corrections that can be made if you feel like, you know what, maybe we're flirting with this a little bit.
Yeah, this is calling an audible here. We had said we might not bring this up, but I do think maybe it would be helpful if we gave just. Sometimes there's a lack of self-awareness, AJ, on do we have a low accountability culture? And how can you know that? So I just want to, I don't want to talk in detail about these things. I just want to do a quick hit list of indicators. If you're listening to these things, you go, oh, that describes our church. These would be indicators that you have a low accountability culture and it's going to cause you some problems. So maybe all these things alone, AJ, could be their own episode sometime, but let me just hit them quickly.
Yeah.
So if the senior pastor, number one, if the senior pastors heavily influenced the selection of board members, like they are his pet group of people.
Yeah,
that's
handpicked.
an indicator that low accountability. Senior pastor is the only staff member with a regular and consistent voice to the board. That's not usually a good situation. In fact, just had a conversation the other day with a staff that has this problem where really would help if there was maybe another staff person on the board who is ex officio. So they're not a voting member. They're not influencing things that way, but they are just an extra voice. Number 3, senior pastor sets the agenda for ministry and the board more or less just rubber stamps that agenda. So the board isn't really involved in decision-making at all. They're pretty much just there to support whatever the pastor says. The staff forms the budget and the board gives little to no input on the budget making process. Now, this is a tough one. I believe the staff should make the budget. But if the board doesn't even look at it, they just go, yeah, whatever you guys say is fine. Yeah, that's not good either. There's not a lot of accountability in that situation. Board members are rarely visible to the outside congregation. Regular attenders may or may not even know the names of the board members. That's That's not good.
Mm-hmm.
People on your board should be involved in ministry. They shouldn't be involved in every tiny, minute aspect of ministry. But when I do training with elders, AJ, I say, why can't you be an elder and a greeter? Serve in some frontline capacity. Don't be leading a small group or something like that. That's going to take up a whole bunch of time, because eldership in and of itself takes up a lot of time. But do something that's frontline and visible. Help serve coffee. Be an usher. Be a greeter. Do something where you're interfacing with a lot of people that isn't a lot of pressure on you.
Yeah.
So usually if outside folks don't even know who the board members are, that's not good. No clear job descriptions for board members outside of just showing up to meetings.
Mm-hmm.
If they can't hold folks accountable if they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. Senior pastor doesn't, or board members rarely interact with staff or meet with staff or give input and insight into ministry. That's usually a bad sign. Senior pastor does not receive an annual performance review from the board. That's a bad sign.
Yeah.
Senior pastor makes autonomous or semi-autonomous personnel decisions so that all the hiring and firing is done exclusively by the pastor without any sort of input from the board. Again, there's some leeway in here. These are just indicators. There are situations where it would make total sense for the pastor to just make autonomous decisions on personnel. Decision-making progress lacks transparency to staff and the congregation. Sorry, I know we talked about maybe not going through those, but as you heard those 10 things, if you're listening to them and going, that describes my church, that should be a red flag to you that there's a low accountability culture in your church.
Yeah. I think an 11th one, even, because I just had this recently, is a situation where the board, there's not really any clear or codified methodology for changing out the board. There's no term limits. There's no procedure for coming off and others coming on.
Yeah, I hear this a lot. So some people have this sort of theological framework that says that once you're an elder, you're always an elder. And I think that there's a difference, though, between elder functionally and elder in character and in, maybe in title even. So you can be an elder in the church and not be actively serving on the board. Having fresh voices. And wouldn't it be great if your church had elders who aren't bogged down, mired in board duties, who can just be, mature leaders in the church who are shepherding people and those kinds of things. So, there's another warning sign, right? If you have to be on a board to feel like you are a leader, that's a warning sign. If I don't have a title, I'm not a leader.
Yeah.
That's not good.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So anyways, just wanted to frame that up so if you're not sure, do we have a low accountability culture? Those things should help you.
Yeah, I think that's good. And you don't have to, don't hit rewind or try to write these down. These will be in today's show notes, and we'll give you the link to that at the end of this broadcast, and you'll be able to read those anytime you want. Let's move on, Scott, to our 5 myths. So starting with number 1 here, a full organizational chart is the same as leadership accountability. So it could be, it might have even turned into a crutch. So you can look at, that 8.5 by 11 printout and go, yep, there's me. And there's another little box above me called church council or elders or whatever your church might call it. And that can be a false sense of security, if you will.
Exactly. Yeah. So I work with some churches, and the single box at the top of an org chart, AJ, is the senior pastor. And there's no question that there's no accountability. But more often there is some sort of structure, whether it be parallel on the org chart or above on the org chart, where you're going, oh no, these people are supposed to hold the pastor accountable. But just because you have that in theory doesn't mean you have it in reality.
Right.
I was just working with the church recently, speaking with the church recently, where this was an exact problem, where the pastor had, I think, 5 or 6 elders, and good-hearted guys, I think, but he felt alone. The pastor didn't feel like he had any help from them.
Mhm.
Didn't feel like they really knew him, or were caring for him, or were leading him. And so, yeah, the first myth is that just because you have people in title who are supposed to be holding you accountable doesn't mean that they actually are. And like you said, it can be a false sense of security to have that org chart filled up, however you're structured. Um, just because they're there doesn't mean they're doing their job.
Yeah, and we're not trying to beat you up on this. There's 100 things that your church may be doing functionally that's different than what is written maybe in the Constitution or an org chart. This is a pretty natural occurrence that we see. Tradition or, just habit turns things that maybe are written one way from a long time ago different from how they're functionally lived out today. And not all of those are, dreadfully unhealthy. And which is just another plug for also you should have a look at your Constitution at least every 5 years or so and just kind of see, are we really doing what we have written down? But this is one of those areas that is definitely more important than maybe something else. I worked with the church once that their Constitution specified what time on Sunday their service had to be. If you've moved on from 9:30 to 10, that's okay. But if you've got what a elder board or church council is supposed to be doing, and that's not longer the case, then that is something that should be looked at.
Right.
All right, number 2, leadership accountability results in an organizational bottleneck. This is myth number 2, that if you have accountability in place, you will now also naturally have a bottleneck to decision making. Not true.
It isn't true. Yeah, if you have a bottleneck, that's not an indicator necessarily of accountability being the problem. You probably have decision-making processes that are unclear, or you've got 15 different committees and a lot of bureaucratic red tape. That is not synonymous with accountability.
Yeah.
Having eyes on a decision is not the same as slowing down a decision. Some exceptions to that. It would be dishonest to say that accountability doesn't pump the brakes a little bit, but that's not the worst thing in the world. If we can slow a key decision down by a week, is that the end of the world? It's not. But it doesn't mean it's an organizational bottleneck. Also, what helps in this, and this would be good kind of looking back at leadership pipeline principles here, AJ, is that it's important to understand what kinds of decisions elders, for example, would have input on.
Sure.
They don't need to provide accountability about decisions about carpet color or paint color or um, minor operational type decisions.
Yeah. What songs will be sung on Sunday?
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
That would be a bottleneck, but they're not there to provide that level of accountability. And to be quite frank, the senior pastor shouldn't be the one providing accountability for staff over all of those things either. So by having a really clearly organized leadership pipeline where everyone understands what their sort of span of control is and what their core competencies are and the area in which they are empowered to make decisions and have authority and autonomy, by clearly defining those things, it ensures that you don't have a bottleneck. But accountability is not the antithesis, is not the going to cause a bottleneck. Other things cause bottlenecks. So don't feel like, well, gosh, if I start running things past my elder team or I start leaning into their leadership more, it's really going to slow things down. No, that's just not true.
We could probably do a whole separate episode on church bottlenecks and decision making because there's a lot
We
of
for sure could.
unhealthy stuff out there. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Our third myth is that subordinates cannot provide leadership accountability. And again, not true. And this would also go back to a healthy leadership pipeline, Scott, in how subordinates in any one level of ministry leadership are trained and maintained and built up and brought up to the next level. So leadership accountability can happen in a 360-degree sphere. And in many cases, that actually is the function in which it is happening with a 360 review. But subordinates absolutely can, and in some cases should, help provide accountability.
Yeah, think back to maybe some. I'm thinking of a specific example, but just to not bring up old wounds. I'm thinking of a prominent example lately, but this is this comes out, I feel like, every time a prominent name, fails out of ministry. You hear later from staffers, "Oh, we knew, we saw,
Yeah.
we this," and people go, "Well, how come we didn't know? Why didn't we see? And the reality is, because they didn't allow subordinates to provide the kind of accountability that they can provide.
Yeah.
They don't provide the same kind of accountability that an oversight board does, but they do provide a certain type of accountability. So like you said, AJ, when you submit yourself as a leader to a 360 review and allow a couple of the people that you lead to give input, even anonymous input, into how you're leading and how you're making decisions and those kinds of things, it's invaluable, because very often you don't see what you don't see. They're called blind spots for a reason.
Yeah.
And the people you're leading very often do see them, because they live in the consequences of your leadership on a daily basis.
Right.
So,
yeah. Well, you just used a key word also. You mentioned they don't often submit themselves to that level of accountability. And so it takes a level of humility on the leader's part to invite that level of leadership accountability from what would technically be a subordinate position. And, and typically the places that we see this not happening, there's an element of narcissistic tendencies, egotistical tendencies, on the leader's part that would keep subordinates at arm's length and not invite that. And then there's also an element, it's a bit of a dance. I think, a healthy subordinate relationship with somebody in a level above you, there's got to be a level of trust built there as well, and care shown from the subordinate side up to the leader, that they're following them as a leader, supporting them as a leader, and out of care and a desire for the ministry to do well, are capable of giving healthy accountability and feedback. So this is good relationship, right? I mean, this is good human relationship.
And just on a very knee-jerk sort of just observational subjective level, toxic leadership, if you sow toxic leadership, you'll reap toxic behavior, both in yourself as the leader and in those that you lead. And so I would say, if you're looking at the people who are underneath you and you see some trends and attitudes and behaviors that trouble you, that is potentially an indicator that there's some toxic behaviors and leadership tendencies in yourself. So if you're seeing that in the people downline, that should be a red flag to you and go, I maybe need to do a gut check. But you're not responsible for everybody underneath you behavior. I just want to be clear about that. But start with the assumption that if you see things you don't like, start with the assumption that it's your fault, and then work from there. Or that you've somehow allowed it to happen or created an environment where those kinds of things can happen, whatever. So just be mindful of that.
Yeah, this is Servant Leadership 101. Quote for today, for the episode: if you sow toxic leadership, you'll reap toxic behavior. We'll meme that, Scott. Can we meme that?
I don't know. Is that it? Is
that a verb?
Is meme a verb? I don't know.
I'm making it.
Let us know.
Memeing this.
Let us know, listeners and watchers, if meme is a verb.
Our fourth myth: leadership accountability should make leaders feel nervous. It does for leaders who need accountability. It does not for leaders who are already serving in a leadership capacity with humility and grace. So myth: leadership accountability should not make leaders feel nervous, Scott.
No, it shouldn't. This is again, we talk about this in leadership pipeline training. This is somehow turning into an advertisement for that, but we have to sort of defang the concept of evaluation or accountability by just making it more frequent. So if I'm used to getting feedback Well, just in our working relationship, AJ, you and I, we're constantly communicating, and I don't feel bad if you write something in a blog post or or we're working on something together, and I go, I don't like the way that looks. Just the other day, I was working on something on our website, and AJ said, "So, how critical do you want me to be right now?" And I was like, "Fully critical. I want you to be fully critical." But it doesn't hurt me when you say those things, AJ, because I'm used to it. That sounds bad. That sounds terrible. What I mean is I'm used to getting feedback from you, and I'm used to giving feedback to you. And so there's trust there. Like, I know that you don't mean something harmful. You only mean to help improve whatever it is I'm working on, and vice versa. So if the only time, AJ, you ever gave me feedback was once a year, and you said, that website thing really that doesn't look good.
Yeah.
And that's the only feedback you gave me all year, I would really internalize that, AJ. I would think, wow, that must mean I'm really bad. I mean, if he said that and he said nothing all year, then it must be epically bad. Or what else is he not telling me, or whatever? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I know this is silly about a website, but giving feedback more frequently, having more frequent accountability makes it feel better than if there's less of it. And that's the myth, AJ. That's what people feel like. Oh, I don't want to go into that meeting. I don't want there to be accountability because something bad might be brought up. But it just gets magnified. If you only get accountability or feedback once or twice a year, you feel all of that so much more than if you're getting regular feedback all of the time. Then it doesn't feel so bad because you're used to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And again, this just comes back to one of those things of humans treating each other decently and having healthy relationships with one another and communicating with one another. So much can be avoided with just some decent communication and kindness. And, but a lot of times I think you end up with this, especially in light of kind of what we're talking about today with leadership accountability. We have levels of leadership in which people seem untouchable, or you've got to just keep your head down, do your job, instead of us all being together on the same team, working towards a unified vision and goal for our ministry, and treating each other as though, we all have a role to play here in the body of Christ. And let's just talk about what we're doing. You could avoid so much animosity and misunderstanding. So it's really kind of funny. It's just kind of jumping out at me as we're going through this. We're like, wow, if we're just decent to one another, keep talking, then we can do better.
Nobody's perfect, right? That old chestnut. Yeah, but nobody's perfect. And if you shine more light on your leadership consistently, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. So I know that it's just runs against what I think is in our human nature. And just going back to the garden, right? Like, I want to hide. I want to cover myself. I want to, be separated in relationship from God and from other people. I'm going to create a barrier for me to hide behind, and that will make me feel better. And, and then God comes and says, no, we're going to shine a light on all of this, and we're going to make it right. And that's what good leadership looks like. Good accountability looks like on a regular basis. Is let's just keep everything in the light, and then there is no fear because the light was on the whole time. There wasn't time for something. This kind of leads into number 5, but there wasn't time for something really truly terrible to develop because the light was on the whole time. Does that make sense? It's only when we choose to retract from accountability that it becomes even more scary, and we're creating more potential for bad things to develop, which leads to number 5.
Number 5, that leadership accountability is just to protect against those big moral failures. Another myth, leadership accountability is just going to keep the whole church organization going well and keeping, of course, it's going to keep the big things from happening. But, Scott, you said this before we went on air. It's those big things. They don't ever start off as just a big thing. You don't go from 0 to 100. There was probably some little things before that.
I'm probably going to upset more than a handful of our listeners by saying this, but I'm not a huge Casting Crowns fan. Like, that's just not my vibe. I hope that doesn't offend anybody. I got nothing against them, but they do have this one song, Slow Fade. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a slow fade. Don't let it get away. It's that, and it's actually really true when it comes to leadership.
Let me just mark that time point for an edit. Okay, go ahead.
You don't want my impression of Casting Crowns? I can't imagine why. At any rate, it's 100% true, and that the pastor who cheats on his spouse, it didn't start there. It started as resentment of spouse, or it started with anger in something leadership related or whatever. Like, it started as something much more benign. And yes, it's not a myth that leadership accountability protects against moral failure. It does, but it doesn't only protect against big moral failure. It protects against all kinds of things. And it doesn't just prevent bad things. It makes other things good. Does that make sense? That's the other thing we think about accountability, is that it's just to prevent bad things. No, it can actually also improve things. It can make things better. And so, yeah, I mean, you got to get that out of your head. I think people think about accountability. Leaders think about accountability as just this. We even talk about it with like an accountability partner. We think about that in the context of moral things. And again, it will help with that, but it could also help with accountability for health, accountability for growth, accountability for spiritual vitality, all kinds of things. It's not just to prevent bad things, it's also to make things better.
There you go. The 5 myths of leadership accountability. Scott, this has been really good, and you can read more about this on our website. Well, thanks for joining us this week on the Church Revitalization Podcast. Link to today's show notes is in the description below, and we'll be back with you again with another fresh topic.